You want to build… what? Are you sure about this? An underground Viking hall, huh? He said, scratching his beard. Never done one of those before. Usually it's just basements, additions, that sort of thing. This is a bit different, I admitted. Different is good, Mike said with a grin. Different is interesting. And frankly, after 20 years of building cookie-cutter houses, I'm ready for something interesting. They'd ask questions like, so this fire pit, it's really going to be underground? And are we going to need like special Viking helmets for this job? I assured them that Viking helmets were optional, though I secretly ordered a few online, just in case. There was nothing quite like a crisp autumn evening gathered around my backyard fire pit. The crackling flames, the scent of wood smoke, the laughter of friends. It was the perfect antidote to the stresses of modern life. We'd tell stories, roast marshmallows, share a few drinks, and generally enjoy the simple pleasure of being together under the stars. The fire pit itself wasn't anything fancy, just a simple metal ring surrounded by a circle of stones, but it was the heart of my backyard, a gathering place, a source of warmth and light. There's something primal about a fire, I thought, watching the flames dance and flicker. Something that connects you to your ancestors, to a simpler time. Plus, roasted marshmallows. What's not to love? The kids would poke at the embers with sticks, their faces illuminated by the firelight, their eyes wide with wonder. My wife would lean against me, a contented sigh escaping her lips. It was pure, unadulterated bliss. But in the perfectly manicured world of Sunridge Estates, even a simple fire pit could become a battleground. I just didn't know how soon the battle would begin. The knock on the door was sharp, insistent, and utterly lacking in warmth. It was the knock of a man who enjoyed enforcing rules, a man who thrived on wielding power, a man who probably color-coded his socks. It was the knock of Douglas Abernathy III. Douglas Abernathy III. The third was crucial, he'd insist, as if anyone would confuse him with some other Douglas Abernathy. He was a man who peaked in middle management, a walking, talking embodiment of every negative stereotype about HOA presidents. He had the permanent sneer of a man who'd just stepped in something unpleasant, and a voice that could make a tax auditor sound charming. He stood on my porch, ramrod straight, his neatly trimmed mustache twitching with disapproval. "Mr. Henderson," he began, his voice a dry, nasal drone. "I'm afraid I must address a matter of grave concern regarding your outdoor combustion unit." He said outdoor combustion unit, as if it were a highly contagious disease. "It's a fire pit, Douglas," I replied, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Indeed," he said, his lips pursing. "And it has come to the attention of the Homeowners Association that said unit is in direct violation of multiple community guidelines. The smoke, Mr. Henderson. The smoke. It's disruptive, it's unpleasant. And frankly, it's simply not in keeping with the aesthetic of Sunridge Estates." He gestured vaguely towards my backyard, his expression conveying a mixture of disgust and righteous indignation. The battle, it seemed, had already begun. The HOA meeting was a masterclass in suburban tyranny. The community center's multi-purpose room, with its beige walls and flickering fluorescent lights, was filled with the usual suspects. A collection of retirees, busybodies, and people who apparently had nothing better to do than complain about their neighbors' landscaping choices. Douglas Abernathy III, presiding over the meeting like a petty dictator, launched into a prepared speech about the dangers and nuisances of open flames. "These fire pits," he declared, his voice dripping with disdain, "are a menace to our community. They produce smoke that disrupts the neighborhood atmosphere. They're a fire hazard. They're unsightly." He projected a series of photos onto the screen. A roaring bonfire, clearly not mine, a plume of black smoke billowing into the air, also not mine, and a picture of my perfectly contained fire pit, looking relatively harmless. This is absurd, I thought, my internal monologue growing increasingly indignant. My fire pit is safer than most people's gas grills. And the smoke? It's wood smoke, Douglas. It smells like camping. It smells like happiness. He went on to cite obscure fire codes, misinterpret safety regulations, and generally paint a picture of my fire pit as a ticking time bomb, a threat to the very fabric of Sunridge Estates. There were other ridiculous topics. Mrs. Gable brought up a petition to ban brightly colored doors. A vote passed to make sure no one put their bins out earlier than 6:08 a.m. The other HOA members, a spineless collection of yes men and yes women, nodded along with his every word. There was no debate, no discussion, no consideration of the fact that my fire pit was well maintained, safely contained, and a source of genuine enjoyment for my family and friends. The motion to ban all open flames, including but not limited to fire pits, chimeneas, and outdoor fireplaces, effective immediately, passed with a near unanimous vote. Douglas Abernathy III banged his gavel, a smug smile spreading across his face. The war on fire had been won. I received the official notice a few days later, a formal, legal-sounding document informing me that I had 30 days to remove my fire pit or face escalating fines and potential legal action. I crumpled the paper in my fist, my initial reaction a mixture of fury and despair. I considered fighting back. I could hire a lawyer, challenge the HOA's decision, and engage in a protracted legal battle. But the thought of spending months, maybe even years, arguing with Douglas Abernathy III and his army of beige-loving bureaucrats filled me with a profound sense of weariness. Fighting Douglas Abernathy III and his army of beige-loving bureaucrats was like trying to reason with a swarm of wasps. You might swat a few, but you're mostly just going to get stung, I thought, pacing around my backyard, staring at the now forbidden fire pit. Then, it hit me. A spark of an idea, audacious, unconventional, and wonderfully subversive. If they wanted to ban fire above ground, then I'd take it underground. I started researching Viking longhouses, Norse mythology, underground structures, feasting halls. My search history quickly filled with images of roaring fires, massive wooden beams, and fur-lined benches. I envisioned a hidden space, a secret sanctuary, a place where I could gather with my friends, enjoy a roaring fire, and thumb my nose at the HOA's ridiculous rules. Douglas Abernathy III, you want a war on fire? You've got one. Prepare to be Vikinged, I declared internally. A plan, as bold as it was subterranean, beginning to take shape in my mind. The fire pit might be gone, but the spirit of the fire would live on, underground. My initial spark of an idea quickly ignited into a full-blown obsession. I immersed myself in the world of Vikings, researching their history, their culture, and, most importantly, their architecture. I devoured books on Norse mythology, watched documentaries about Viking longhouses, and spent hours online, scrolling through images of reconstructed halls and archaeological digs. My search history became a fascinating and slightly alarming mix of Viking hall construction techniques, authentic Norse carvings, mead recipes, and how to build a hidden underground room. I discovered that there was a surprisingly large and passionate online community dedicated to recreating Viking-era structures with detailed plans, tutorials, and even forums where people debated the merits of different types of wood and the proper way to construct a smoke vent. I learned about the langhus, the traditional longhouse, the center of Viking social and political life. I learned about the massive wooden beams, the earthen floors, the central hearths that provided warmth and light. I learned about the intricate carvings, the animal motifs, the symbols of power and protection that adorned these structures. I started sketching out my plans, filling notebooks with drawings of underground chambers, hidden entrances, and elaborate Norse-inspired details. My initial, vague notion of a hidden fire pit was evolving into something far grander, far more ambitious, far more Viking. A mischievous grin spread across my face as I refined my designs. This wasn't just about defying the HOA, it was about creating something truly unique, something that would transport my friends and me to another time and place. It was about building my own personal Valhalla, right under Douglas Abernathy III's perfectly manicured nose. Finding a construction crew willing to build an underground Viking hall in suburban America was, unsurprisingly, a challenge. Most of the contractors I contacted were understandably bewildered by my request. "You want to build—" "What?" was the typical response, followed by a long silence and a hesitant, "Are you sure about this?" I finally found a crew led by a burly, no-nonsense foreman named Mike, who seemed more amused than confused by my project. "An underground Viking hall, huh?" he said, scratching his beard. "Never done one of those before. Usually it's just basements, additions, that sort of thing." "This is a bit different," I admitted. "Different is good," Mike said with a grin. "Different is interesting. And, frankly, after 20 years of building cookie-cutter houses, I'm ready for something interesting." His crew, a mix of seasoned veterans and younger guys eager to prove themselves, shared his enthusiasm, albeit with a healthy dose of skepticism. They'd ask questions like, "So this fire pit, it's really going to be underground? And are we going to need, like, special Viking helmets for this job?" I assured them that Viking helmets were optional, though I secretly ordered a few online, just in case. I explained my vision, showed them my sketches, and emphasized the need for secrecy. They looked at me, looked at each other, and then burst out laughing. But they were in. They were intrigued. And I suspected they were just as eager as I was to see the look on Douglas Abernathy III's face when he finally discovered what was going on beneath his perfectly regulated neighborhood. The construction process was a marvel of clandestine engineering. We started with the basement expansion, a perfectly legitimate project, on paper at least. The excavation began, a giant hole appearing in my backyard, much to the consternation of my neighbors. Giant trucks arrived, delivering loads of lumber, stone, and other materials. The noise was considerable, but we kept it within the allowable hours, adhering strictly to the city's noise ordinances, a small act of compliance that I found deeply satisfying. The key, of course, was the hidden entrance. We constructed a sturdy, reinforced wooden frame for the underground hall, carefully concealing the access point beneath a seemingly ordinary garden shed. The shed itself was on wheels, allowing it to be rolled away, revealing a set of stairs leading down into the darkness. It was a delicate balancing act, maintaining the appearance of a normal, if slightly disruptive, construction project, while secretly creating a hidden Viking world beneath the surface. We worked quickly, efficiently, and with a shared sense of mischievous purpose. The neighbors, understandably, were curious. They'd stop by, asking questions, peering into the excavation pit, trying to figure out what was going on. I'd offer vague explanations, talking about expanding the basement, adding a recreation room, or creating a wine cellar, which technically wasn't entirely untrue. Douglas Abernathy III, of course, was the most suspicious. He'd patrol the perimeter of my property, his eyes narrowed, his clipboard clutched tightly in his hand, searching for any sign of violation, any evidence of my nefarious plot. But we were careful, meticulous, and utterly determined to keep our secret safe. The Viking Hall remained hidden, a subterranean world of fire and feasting, waiting to be unleashed. With the structure complete, it was time to furnish my underground Valhalla. This was where the real fun began. I scoured antique shops, online auctions, and even a few Renaissance fairs, searching for the perfect Viking-themed decor. I found a massive handcrafted wooden table, long enough to seat a dozen warriors, or, my friends and family. I acquired a set of fur-lined benches, surprisingly comfortable and surprisingly expensive. I commissioned a local artist to create Norse-inspired carvings for the wooden support beams, depicting scenes of dragons, longships, and mythical battles. I hung a giant replica Viking shield on the wall, a symbol of strength and defiance. I installed torch sconces fitted with flickering LED lights to create a warm, inviting glow. And of course, there was the fire pit, a massive stone-lined hearth positioned in the center of the hall, complete with a state-of-the-art ventilation system that would, hopefully, prevent us all from suffocating from smoke inhalation. Finding authentic Viking artifacts proved challenging. I settled for a mix of high-quality replicas and inspired-by pieces. My drinking horns were plastic, not actual animal horns, and my Viking swords were definitely not battle-ready. But the overall effect was impressive. It was ridiculous. It was over the top. It was perfect. And it was all completely hidden from the prying eyes of Douglas Abernathy III, I thought, surveying my completed creation. It was a subterranean sanctuary, a hidden world of fire and feasting, a testament to the power of imagination and the enduring appeal of Viking culture. It was ready. The construction of my underground Viking hall, while conducted with as much secrecy as possible, was not entirely without its visible signs. Large trucks, laden with lumber, stone, and other mysterious materials, began arriving at my house with alarming regularity. It was like watching a medieval castle being assembled, piece by piece, in the middle of suburbia. And, of course, Douglas Abernathy III noticed. He'd always been a watchful presence in the neighborhood, a self-appointed guardian of order and conformity, but now his vigilance reached new heights. He'd patrol the street, his eyes narrowed, his clipboard clutched tightly in his hand, taking notes on every delivery, every vehicle, every perceived deviation from the norm. He'd stop the delivery drivers, peppering them with questions. "What's all this for?" he'd demand. "What's Henderson building back there?" The drivers, sworn to secrecy, and slightly intimidated by my increasingly unhinged enthusiasm for the project, would offer vague, non-committal answers. "Just some home improvements," they'd say. "Landscaping stuff." I, meanwhile, maintained an innocent facade. I'd wave cheerfully to Douglas whenever I saw him, offering a friendly "Morning, Douglas. Lovely day, isn't it?" as if I wasn't secretly constructing a subterranean Viking fortress beneath his perfectly manicured lawn. I'd even go out of my way to engage him in small talk about the weather, the local sports teams, anything to distract him from the massive construction project unfolding just a few feet away. It was a game of cat and mouse, a delicate dance of deception, and I was relishing every moment of it. Before unleashing the full glory of my Viking hall upon the unsuspecting neighborhood, I decided to hold a small, test-run gathering. I invited a few close friends, sworn them to secrecy, and prepared a modest feast of roasted meats, crusty bread, and, of course, plenty of mead. The evening was a resounding success. The fire roared, the music played, a carefully curated playlist of Viking-themed folk metal, and the laughter and conversation flowed freely. It was a magical, surreal experience, like stepping back in time to a world of warriors, legends, and epic feasts. But even underground, we weren't entirely immune to the prying ears of Douglas Abernathy III. The sounds of our revelry, muffled but still audible, reached the surface. The rhythmic beat of the music, The occasional roar of laughter, the clinking of drinking horns. It was enough to arouse Douglas's suspicion. He emerged from his house, a flashlight in hand, his face a mask of indignant curiosity. He prowled around my yard, his beam of light cutting through the darkness, searching for the source of the mysterious sounds. He peered into windows, he listened at walls, he even tried, unsuccessfully, to peer into the ventilation shaft of the, seemingly innocent, garden shed. He couldn't find us. The Viking Hall, by design, was completely hidden, its entrance concealed, its existence a secret known only to a select few. But the sounds, the tantalizing whispers of merriment drove him to the brink of madness. He knew something was going on, something unapproved, something fun, and it was driving him crazy. He circled and muttered, shining that flashlight around. The next morning, Douglas was waiting for me. He stood on my porch, his arms crossed, his face a thundercloud of righteous indignation. "Mr. Henderson," he began, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage, "I know you're up to something. I heard it last night. The noise, the music. What have you done with the fire pit?" I feigned innocence. "The fire pit, Douglas?" I said with a carefully crafted expression of confusion. "I removed it, of course, as per your instructions, weeks ago." "Then what's all that noise?" he demanded, his voice rising. "And the smell of wood smoke and those deliveries. What are you building back there, Henderson? A bomb shelter?" I smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that I knew would infuriate him. "Just a basement remodel, Douglas," I said, my voice calm and measured. "We're, big fans of Scandinavian design. Very minimalist. Very hygge. I'd learned that word just for this occasion. "Scandinavian design?" he repeated, his eyes narrowing. "In your basement." "Indeed," I said. "It's all the rage. Very underground." I couldn't resist the pun. Watching Douglas's face twitch with suspicion and frustration was almost as good as a roaring fire. Almost, I thought, savoring the moment. He knew I was lying. He knew I was up to something, but he couldn't prove it. He couldn't see it. He couldn't touch it. "I'll be keeping an eye on you, Henderson," he said, his voice a low growl. "A very close eye." "Please do," I replied, with a cheerful wave. "And if you'd like, I'd be happy to give you a tour of the basement once it's finished." He turned and stomped away, his navy blazer flapping in the breeze, a defeated, deflated dictator. The battle lines were drawn, and I was ready for the war. Douglas, true to his word, intensified his surveillance. He'd patrol the street, peering into my yard, his clipboard at the ready, searching for any sign of my basement remodel. He'd even started taking pictures, documenting every delivery, every pile of dirt, every perceived violation of HOA regulations, but he couldn't find anything. The entrance to the Viking Hall was, as planned, completely hidden. The seemingly ordinary garden shed, positioned strategically over the access point, was the key. It was a sturdy structure, built on a reinforced concrete foundation with a locking door and no visible windows. To the casual observer, it was just a shed, a place to store tools and gardening supplies. But beneath the shed, a set of heavy wooden stairs led down into the darkness, into the heart of my subterranean Valhalla. The shed itself was mounted on heavy-duty wheels, allowing it to be rolled away with a bit of effort, revealing the hidden entrance. It was a simple, elegant solution, and it was utterly Douglas-proof. He tried everything. He'd knock on the shed door, pretending to be interested in borrowing a tool. He'd try to peer through the cracks in the wood, hoping to catch a glimpse of something suspicious. He'd even try to accidentally bump into the shed, hoping to dislodge it and reveal the secrets beneath. But it was all for naught. The shed remained stubbornly in place, guarding its secret, a silent sentinel against the forces of HOA tyranny. Douglas's frustration grew with each failed attempt, his paranoia reaching new heights. He was obsessed, consumed by the mystery of my basement remodel. And I was relishing every moment of his torment. The hidden entrance was my masterpiece of deception, and it was working perfectly. The time had come. The Viking Hall was complete, the fire pit was roaring, and my friends and allies were assembled for the grand unveiling. I'd sent out invitations, carefully worded to avoid arousing suspicion, inviting them to a special themed gathering at my house. They arrived, curious and slightly apprehensive, knowing only that I'd been up to something in my backyard. I led them, one by one, to the seemingly ordinary garden shed, rolled it aside, with a dramatic flourish, of course, and revealed the hidden staircase leading down into the darkness. Their reactions were priceless. Gasps of astonishment, murmurs of disbelief, and then, inevitably, laughter. They descended into the hall, their eyes widening as they took in the scene. The massive fire pit, blazing merrily in the center of the room, cast a warm, flickering glow on the wooden beams, the Norse carvings, and the long, handcrafted feasting table. The air was filled with the scent of wood smoke, roasted meat, a whole hog, courtesy of a very understanding butcher, and the sounds of Viking-themed folk metal, courtesy of my carefully curated playlist. My friends, dressed in a mix of regular clothes and hastily assembled Viking costumes, explored the hall with childlike wonder. They admired the fur-lined benches, they examined the giant Viking shield on the wall, and they marveled at the sheer audacity of the entire project. Drinking horns were filled with mead and ale, toasts were made, and the feast began. It was a night of laughter, camaraderie, and glorious, unadulterated revelry. It was everything I'd hoped for, and more. It was the perfect unveiling of my subterranean masterpiece. Of course, it wouldn't be a proper Viking feast without a little bit of drama, and who better to provide that drama than Douglas Abernathy III? Alerted by the sounds of merriment, and I suspect the tantalizing aroma of roasting hog, Douglas and a small contingent of his most loyal HOA cronies arrived at my house, their faces set in expressions of grim determination. They marched across my lawn, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, their voices raised in righteous indignation. "We know you're up to something, Henderson," Douglas bellowed. "We can hear the noise. We demand to be let in." I emerged from the garden shed, feigning surprise. "Douglas," I said, "what a pleasant surprise. What brings you to my humble abode?" "Don't play innocent with me, Henderson," he snapped. "We know you're violating HOA regulations. We demand to see what's going on in your, basement." I smiled. "Of course, Douglas. Follow me." I led them to the shed, their anticipation and suspicion growing with each step. But yet again the shed sat there. Closed. Just a shed. Nothing to see. They circled and peered, faces twisted in anger. Douglas, fueled by a mixture of frustration and desperation, called in the big guns, a city building inspector. He was convinced that I'd violated some code, some regulation, some obscure law that would allow him to shut down my underground den of iniquity. The inspector, a weary-looking man named Bob, not the same Bob from the pool incident, thankfully, arrived the next morning, clipboard in hand, ready to assess the situation. I led him to the shed, rolled it aside, and gestured towards the hidden staircase. "After you," I said with a flourish. Bob descended into the Viking Hall, his expression a mixture of confusion and awe. He spent a long time down there, examining the structure, the ventilation system, the fire pit, and all the other details. He consulted his codebook. He took measurements. He made notes. Finally, he emerged, blinking in the sunlight. "Well," he said, turning to a fuming Douglas, "I can't find any violations. The structure is sound, the ventilation is adequate, and everything seems to be up to code." He paused, a slight smile playing on his lips. "Actually," he added, "it's quite impressive. Very historically accurate. You've done a remarkable job, Mr. Henderson." Douglas looked like he'd been struck by lightning. He sputtered, he stammered, he tried to argue, but it was no use. The inspector's verdict was final. My underground Viking Hall was not only legal, it was amazing. As word of his failed inspection spread, a local college professor, Dr. Eleanor Vance, head of the history department, caught wind. A specialist in Norse history and the Viking Age, she was initially skeptical, expecting a poorly made, inaccurate mess. However, upon inspection, she was delighted, announcing it was a wonderful educational resource. She wanted to feature the hall, do interviews, maybe even get a grant to do an archaeological dig. Any further action by the HOA would be a PR disaster, going against historical and educational considerations. Douglas, publicly humiliated and outmaneuvered, resigned. His carefully built, beige world, shattered by a buried long haul. My underground Viking Hall became a local legend, a whispered-about curiosity that drew visitors from far and wide. It was featured in local newspapers, on regional television news, and even on a few obscure online travel blogs. People were fascinated by the story, by the sheer audacity of building a hidden Viking Hall in the middle of suburbia. I started receiving requests for tours, for parties, for even Viking-themed weddings. The Great Hall of Sunridge Estates, as it became known, was a unique, unforgettable destination, a testament to the power of creativity and the enduring appeal of Viking culture. It was also, of course, a constant, glorious reminder of Douglas Abernathy III's defeat. I embraced my newfound role as the Viking chieftain of Sunridge Estates. I hosted regular feasts and events in the hall, celebrating Norse holidays, welcoming new neighbors, and generally fostering a sense of community and camaraderie. The HOA, now under new, more enlightened leadership, even started sponsoring some of the events, recognizing the positive impact my underground den was having on the neighborhood. The HOA, once the bane of my existence, now a group that could do nothing but watch on in awe. It was a crisp autumn evening, much like the ones that had inspired this whole crazy adventure. I sat at the head of my long, wooden feasting table, surrounded by friends and neighbors, the fire roaring merrily in the central hearth. The air was filled with laughter, the clinking of drinking horns, and the sounds of Viking folk music. I raised my horn, filled with homemade mead, in a toast. Who knew that a fire pit ban and a burning desire for revenge could lead to all this? I guess sometimes you just gotta build an underground Viking hall to find your peace, I thought, a smile playing on my lips. "To the great hall of Sunridge Estates," I declared, my voice echoing through the underground chamber. "May its fires burn bright, its mead flow freely, and its existence forever torment Douglas Abernathy III." The assembled guests roared their approval, raising their horns in a chorus of "Skál!"